So welcome, everyone, to this evening at Apple Farm. Helen said in her essay on, so we're kind of doing Jung, beginning Jung again. And she wondered in her essay, what does it mean to live the symbolic life? And she answered by saying, it's most definitely not to spend certain hours of the week on the study of symbols and images, and then to live the rest of our lives on a non-symbolic level. On the contrary, there's no smallest detail that is not symbolic. She said, we don't split into the fact and the meaning. It simply is in itself. So tonight we open again into Don Troyer's teaching. I'll just remind us that if we were at Apple Farm, we would pass the hat, and we can pass the virtual hat by using the PayPal function or sending a little money when it's convenient to do so. Don has invited us always to respond during his talks. Raise a hand.
Tell your provider about vision problems or changes. Taking Ozempic with a cephalurea or insulin may increase low blood sugar risk. Side effects like nausea and diarrhea.
There we go. Thanks, Ophelia. I think you're muted now. And welcome. And so raise your hand or simply speak. You can hold the space bar down if you want to speak, or you can unmute. And that'll be a way to make some exchange in this evening's dialogue. So Don Troyer, welcome again. And we turn this now to you.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, the phrase that came to me this morning was, maybe we need to sort of have an ask an analyst kind of openness to things that came up in our last Thursday evening meeting, or things from your reading. It doesn't necessarily have to relate immediately to what we're talking about today. So I want you to feel free, if you have questions about Jung, analytic psychology, feel free to prompt those. We can go with that too. But tonight, we're going to be talking at the beginning about complex, what a complex is and complexes. And it's a rather basic to Jung, because Jung's psychology sometimes has been called a complex psychology, a psychology of complexes, about complexes. You know, he came to this early in his career when he devised the association test, which was a simple experimental test in which a person was given a list of words, and they were supposed to report the first word that came to them when they read that word or when they heard it. And the test required measuring their response, how long it took for them to respond with whatever it was, how long it took. And Jung found that the longer the delay in responding to the word, the prompt, mapped a picture of that person's unconscious psychology. It's the same technology that is used in modern forensic science, the lie detector test. It's the same kind of theory. So Jung felt that he had discovered these areas of complex in the human psyche, and he was very interested in it. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about tonight. I thought I'd give you an example of a complex from my day today. Is that it was a busy day, and I rushed out of the office, and I got halfway home before I realized I'd left my notes for tonight at the office. So I had to turn around and go back. Fortunately, I had enough time. But that's an example of how absent-mindedness, slips of the tongue, things that come into your mind unbidden are all examples of how complexes are part of our life and influence us. So in our reading on lecture 3 and paragraph 148, Jung writes, a complex is an agglomeration of association, a sort of picture of a more or less complicated psychological nature, sometimes of traumatic character, sometimes simply of a painful or highly toned character. If, for instance, something is very important to me, I begin to hesitate when I attempt to do it. And if you have probably observed when you ask me a difficult question, I cannot answer them immediately because the subject is important and I have a long reaction time. So this is a clue to the complex. When we're confronted with something and we have a long reaction time, it usually indicates that it stirred up some kind of area of feeling, memory, experience within that's gotten jogged or awakened a bit. And he continues in the next paragraph, in the same paragraph actually, he says, whenever there's a high tonus, it is just as if that particular complex had a body of its own, as if it were localized in my body to a certain extent. So he felt these were rooted in the body. And in the next paragraph, 149, he says, that leads me to something very important, the fact that a complex with its given tension or energy has the tendency to form a little personality of itself. It has a sort of body, a certain amount of its own physiology. It can upset the stomach. It upsets the breathing. It disturbs the heart. In short, it behaves like a partial personality. For instance, when you want to say or do something and unfortunately a complex interferes with that intention, then you say or do something different from what you intended. You are simply interrupted. Then your best intention gets upset by the complex. Exactly as if you had been interfered by a human being. So this is pretty, in and of itself, maybe commonly known, but it's still a radical idea in modern psychology, which mostly tends to focus on the ego as the only complex. The ego complex and its control or absence thereof becomes the focus. We meet complexes not only in these incidents that we've talked about, but also they appear in personified forms in dreams. So dreams are pictures of, you could look at dreams as pictures of our complexes. They show up in personified form.
Don, can I go back a second?
Sure, Marla.
When you talk about the ego complex, that one is just seems strange to me, but does it mean that all of our experience and attitudes and things we think about ourselves, all the stuff that goes on in our head about ourselves, that's all the ego complex?
Yeah, I think Jung thought that our ego consciousness was a kind of complex. It's just one of many. And that threatens our sense of our ego as being supreme and in control, and we're masters of our own fate and all that stuff. But Jung didn't feel that way at all. He thought we were much more like a group process. And our ego, if you think about the power that complexes can sometimes have. For example, this week I was working with a person who has a difficult relationship in the family, a brother who's an alcoholic, And every time she talks to this brother or anticipates talking to this brother, she gets a stomach pain. Well, this is her body complex around the effect of her brother on her. And it's actually led to some ulcers. So that's the connection between feelings and physiological responses. That answer your question, Marla?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now, there are modern iterations that have built on or borrowed or stolen from Jung's work on complexes, and one that's popularly known is Richard Schwartz's internal family systems therapy. And he's codified his take on this into looking at different elements in a person's conscious that function in different ways. And he's named them. The typical ones are exiles, pieces of our complex that we don't want to deal with and disavow and feel guilty about or hate, and managers who try to keep them in line and mediate between the exiles and the ego, and then firefighters who get mobilized whenever the complex gets too stirred up. And he's built a whole therapy system around this. With no, as far as I can tell, no attribution to Jung. So, and other people have built something called Schema Therapy, which looks at these patterns in our psyche as schemas or patterns that influence us. And it's another way of naming this process that Jung was a pioneer in discovering. An uncommon clinical situation that shows this in an extreme is the situation where people have dissociative identity disorder, in which these various subpersonalities or partial personalities, usually through massive trauma, attain such autonomy and independence that they actually take over from time to time and displace the ego, so that the person many times has no memory of when these alternate personalities come in and do things. Often that the ego, if it were in charge, would be opposed to or horrified by. But these other subpersonalities then act in the person's life. And that can be obviously a very serious and difficult thing to treat, but it's an extension of this idea of complex in Jung's psychology.
Don, I got a question about,
Sure, Ken.
let's just say a compulsion to overshop or overspend. And is it possible, I mean, that would be a complex, probably filling some kind of a void somewhere.
Could be.
But if a person does not engage with that, can it be changed or extinguished over time? If it's not fed, will it die?
Yeah, that's a good point. Complexes often operate automatically. They function as a compulsion or an obsession. In their area of control, they rule. So the treatment of these things does require both recognizing them, objectifying them in some ways, allowing them to have a voice and probably a form of some kind, so the ego can relate to them more consciously. And if you can relate to them and find out what drives them, what motivates them, what's their compulsion all about, many times it can be modified. Many times the complex is trying to get something in a sort of addictive way that is replacing something it actually needs, but either can't get or doesn't quite know what it really wants, or feels that it can't have it. So it gets into a repetition compulsion of getting something that takes the place of what it really wants. This is common in addiction, where people seek a substance to give them a temporary fix of feeling better, but it often is not the real thing down at the core of their personality that they really want. And helping them deconstruct that and realize that is a very important task. And an important example of that was when a person addicted to alcohol consulted Jung back in the day. And he was advised that his problem was he was drinking the wrong spirit. He had a spiritual thirst that he was trying to satisfy with alcohol, and that could never work. And he and people around him were founders of AA, as you probably know, Ken. So that was Jung's link to the founding of AA.
There's a reason they call it spirits.
That's right. So in paragraph 151, Jung goes on to say, we like to think that we are one, but we are not, most decidedly not one. One interesting comment he made in paragraph 152 is, you can read a writer's mind when you study the characters they create. In other words, when a writer creates, he's operating out of his or her own imagination. But what is that imagination populated by? His complexes. In my experience, working with writers, I'm trying to be a good analyst for them, and I read all their works. But when I go into their works and try to offer an interpretation of their complexes through their characters in their writing, they don't take kindly to that. It's like I've cheated somehow. I've looked behind the curtain, and it doesn't usually go well. You'd think it would, but it doesn't. I don't know if any of you have had any experience with artists and interpreting their work, but in this lecture, Jung goes on to give some examples of his association tests and how he could use it to predict problems. In paragraph 136, he said, the daughter of an alcoholic who has had a hell of a youth will seek a man who is an alcoholic and marry him. And if by chance he should not be one, she will make him into one on account of that peculiar identity with one member of the family. In other words, when he did the association test, he found an identity between the daughter and the alcoholic father. And because of that kind of affinity, he's predicting that she would be prone to repeat the pattern in a man she chooses to marry. And if he wasn't an alcoholic to begin with, she'd make him into one.
Is that kind of like if you had my wife, you'd drink too?
The other thing he mentions in paragraph 158 is that if partners in a marital relationship or committed relationship are too similar in their patterns of doing the association test, it's a problem because it's too harmonious. And after a period of time in paradise, these people will kick against each other after a while because they're just too harmonious. A very good harmony in a family based on participation soon leads to frantic attempts on the part of the spouses to kick loose from each other. So it's an example of how sometimes opposites attract, because there's this chemistry, but when the initial romantic hue has worn off and the work of living in an everyday sense with a real person sets in, there are difficulties. So, this gives a lie to these matching sites that want to preach people to find people that have exactly the same kind of activities or likes or propensities that you do, because it probably sets them up for something of an opposite experience over time. Okay, well, that kind of closes up the initial comments on complexes. Any other comments on those? Well, next, he goes on to talk about dreams. And
Don,
yeah,
may
yes.
I return to something you pointed out earlier about we are not one?
Yes.
I can resonate with the thought that we're all made up of this complex of a council of people within us.
Mm-hmm.
Might be a way of thinking of it. And yet I'm thinking about, I hold that intention with the oneness of the divine. Is that aspirational only? Is there not a reality that is one even unto ourselves? Is that what we're reaching for? I think of the loving with heart, soul, mind, and body. There's a oneness there that's called for and is calling to us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question and a theological one. My own view of it, it's more like a hologram. It's like there may be, there's an underlying oneness, but it has many, many manifestations and facets. And so we often can't get to that kind of sense of unification or oneness in our multiplicity. But it doesn't mean that oneness doesn't exist. And many of us have moments of feeling at one with things, peak experiences or numinous experiences. But our everyday plight is to deal with this multiplicity, I think. So I think it's both, actually, Dawn. I don't think it's one or the other. And that's a paradox. I get it.
Right.
But that's what infinity is. It's a paradox, right?
I was also thinking that the self, I think of the unity as the self, the part of us that's the God image in us, and it's behind all the complexes because it wants us to be connected and wants us to be one. So it's really manufacturing some of these experiences for us so that we can move toward it. That's kind of how I think of it.
The other thing I would add to the question, Dawn, is that in working with people's dreams, the self appears in many different forms. It doesn't come in just one form. It comes in cultural and family-based forms. So I think the point is that we don't get over attached in a way of making an icon or a golden calf out of one form, but that the spirit is free to manifest itself in a variety of forms. And it's up to us to remain humble enough and open enough to recognize it when it happens.
If I'm following all this correctly, one thing that comes to my mind is that everything belongs. And so you've got these differences, but all those differences belong to the whole of the couple in this case.
It's not that there isn't tension and conflict and enmity at times. But as long as there's a relational process and things are working, there's some apposition or movement. I think it does, the psyche does move towards these experiences of wholeness of the self, of mandalic experiences, as reminders that this unity does exist in spite of our often overwhelmed multiplicity.
I think the confusion comes for me when I associate unity with all that is good, as if God is all that is good, when I think of Job, for example, and the unity of God represented there is fantastically and horrifically complex.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
And manifested in so many ways, including the terrors that Job experiences. And
Sure.
that too may be of God, may be of the one.
Well, I think it keeps us humble about our assumptions about what is good and not so good, because we can't see a wide enough lens to make those final judgments. We certainly know what feels good and what feels bad, but what is ultimate good and ultimate bad is hard for us, I think, to know fully.
Thank you. Thank you.
And, you know, as you probably know, Jung took God on in his Answer to Job book, where he had a strong feeling about the unfairness of that, this plight that we're in, to be stuck in this three-dimensional finite world where we have to be continually making choices about better and worse and good and evil. But our powers are so limited. We have the power of choice, but our vision is very limited. So we can only do the best we can. And Jung was a little put out that the deck seemed to be stacked against us sometimes. So Jung believed that dreams were an objective source of information. And this, again, is kind of still a radical notion, because many modern people either disregard dreams completely, or if they pay attention at all, they view them as sort of subjective afterthoughts of the day, not as objective sources of information. Jung also commented he didn't like to interpret a single freestanding dream, because he felt that dreams tell a narrative. If you follow them over time, more of their meaning can be revealed. In paragraph 167, he is talking about the common experience of feeling nervous, anxious and nervous. And he's saying that one of the reasons that we feel that way is that there is an unconscious resistance to conscious intention. When our consciousness wants one thing or has a direction in mind, and our unconscious has a different direction in mind, it sets up a tension, and that's often experienced as anxiety. So I had to think about that when I forgot my papers at the office tonight, and thinking, what's my conscious intention here? And what does the unconscious want with me about this? I think sometimes when I get overextended, my unconscious reminds me of my limits. He makes this interesting comment in paragraph 168. We always forget that our consciousness is only a surface. Our consciousness is the avant-garde of our psychological existence. Our head is only one end, but behind our consciousness is a long historical tale of hesitations and weaknesses and complexes and prejudices and inheritances. And we always make our reckoning without them. We think we can make a straight line in spite of our shortcomings, but they will weigh very heavily and often we derail before we have reached our goal because we have neglected our tail ends. So this is a word to stop and pay attention to these tail end parts of us that we may regard as inferior or weak, or that we just have to impose our will on them by pure willpower. Because they're part of us too, part of our humanness, and we need to listen, take some time to listen to them. These more inferior, shadowy parts, often they're child complexes, younger parts of us that feel overwhelmed or sad or abandoned. And Jung really felt that we needed to have an open dialogue with those, that we just go based on our ego ideals, we set ourselves up for trouble. He said, I always say that our psychology has a long saurian tail. Saurian means reptilian. So there's these reptilian layers of instinctual inheritance that we carry around with us that almost is like a tail we drag around with us. So in paragraph 174, he says, I handle the dream as if it were a text which I do not understand properly, say a Latin or a Greek or a Sanskrit text, where certain words are unknown to me, or the text is fragmentary. And I merely apply the ordinary method any philologist would apply to reading such a text. My idea is that the dream does not conceal, we simply do not understand its language. So that's where the assumption around using associations to dreams comes. If you can access your unconscious association to a dream setting or a figure in a dream or a situation, you've accessed your imagination to associate it to yourself in your personal experience. And many times the meaning of the dream will emerge from that, even if it starts out appearing very bizarre and foreign.
Don, is there a difference between, can you hear me?
Yep.
Am I muted or not? Okay. Is there a difference between free association and association? There's another word he used too, association, and what was the other word he used? I don't remember, but
Amplification.
Yeah, that's it. Uh-huh.
Yeah, there is a difference, Marla. Freud coined the term free association, and that was his method when people were having a Freudian analysis and they were lying on the couch with the analyst back to them. They were supposed to just say whatever came into their mind and just continue that thought. So it's an association to one's own thoughts. Whereas Jung took limited the association process to dream images. So you start with the image and you associate to that rather than free associating to your conscious thoughts. So you're working more directly with the unconscious.
So free association could take you farther from the original image.
Yeah.
Okay.
It takes you wherever, your imagination would want to go. So
then when you're working on a dream, should you keep calling yourself back to the original image?
that's often very helpful to go back to the original image and keep working with that. Sometimes it takes time for the meaning to emerge. One recommendation about dream work that I remember and try to use sometimes is that the dictum that when you're working with a dream, try to bring in the dreamer. In other words, you're trying to have the dreamer re-inhabit the dream and see the dream from their dream self, as opposed to looking at it objectively as if it's a story or something. So you're inviting people to go back into the dream and feel the feelings of that. And one other little trick that sometimes is helpful is you invite the dreamer to look at the dream from the different participants' point of view. So if there's a family setting, you have them go back and look at the situation from each of the persons, each of the characters in the dream. And sometimes that is revelatory in terms of what the dream might be about. So you're looking at the dream not just from the ego standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You might also, go ahead, Joanne.
No, go.
I was just going to say you're trying to look at it from the various complexes viewpoint.
Uh-huh.
Then, so you're in a sense you're honoring the complex. Let me think about your point of view.
So each character in the dream represents a complex.
Well, it could. It sometimes
Yeah.
does. It's worth thinking that it might.
Mhm.
It doesn't always, but sometimes, yeah.
The business that you said about the dream, it doesn't try to hide things or conceal them, but
Yeah.
you need to learn its language. It's happened to me several times that something is or someone has a name in the dream, and I do everything I can do to its name I don't know to understand the name or find it, and it's happened to me years later, and suddenly I'll come across this name or this word, and then the illumination, and then I go back to the dream from this age now, or this perspective. But I was also thinking about how Helen returned to her dreams, and we get glimpses of that a lot in such stuff as dreams are made on in her diaries.
Yes.
And she'll be working along in some year, and that'll remind her of a dream that she had, way back here. And now it has something to say to her now at this age, or whatever.
Yeah, it's really inspiration to people like me to read of Helen's life and Jung's, because these folks were really, what's the word? Taken by dreams. They really were smitten by dreams and really relied on dreams on a regular basis to guide them. So it was a living process, not a theoretical process for them. They really went with the dream. And I admire that. I admire that when people have that kind of profound trust and courage.
What you just described to me, Don, sounds like a devotion.
Yeah.
Devotion to the dream.
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
Okay.
Did Helen have anybody else help her work on dreams?
Well, she consulted with Jung a few times, and those were profound. But I honestly don't know if she shared her dreams once she was at Apple Farm. Do
Yes,
you know?
she did. I do know. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she did.
She did all the way to her death.
Did she work with another person, or did she work with
did.
several people? She did.
did.
Jane Bishop, for one.
In the end, it was Jane. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Very closely.
Yeah, that reminds me that Jung taught that our own dreams are a mystery to us because they're always a bit ahead of our consciousness. So that's the value of having the humility and devotion to working on your dreams with another person, because oftentimes that additional perspective is exactly what you need to see what's going on in the dream, because we're too close to it. We can't see it because it is us in a sense. going to jump ahead to paragraph 218. Where Jung writes, mystics are people who have a particularly vivid experience of the processes of the collective unconscious. Mystical experience is experience of the archetypes. So I thought that's an interesting take on mystical experience, that it's a powerful and more direct experience of this archetypal realm. One comment in paragraph 212, he talks about the importance of our most inferior function as a most precious connection with the unconscious, which is invariably the weakest. Only through our feebleness and incapacity are we linked up with the unconscious, with the lower world of the instincts, and with our fellow human beings. So as much as we may find our inferior function an affliction, an annoyance, and shameful, he points out that it really is an important piece of being grounded and humble and connected to the human experience. So just like these other comments he made about the saurian tail and needing to honor our hesitations and weaknesses, he also wants to apply that same respect and acceptance to the most inferior of our functions.
Did he say at some point that the inferior function is the connection to the unconscious?
Yeah, he thinks it's the closest connection to the unconscious because it's the least controlled by the ego.
So explain how that would work.
Well, what comes to mind is an example I've shared before in which I took on the task of changing out the heating element in our water heater. And as you might guess, sensation is my most inferior function. Things having to do with detailed tool kinds of works, mechanical things. I'm all thumbs. But I thought, how hard can it be, you know? Well, 50 gallons of water in the basement later, and a new level of cursing that my wife has never heard before. I did manage to get it done, but I would have been a lot smarter to get some help. I mean, let somebody who has skills in the sensation area take care of this. I mean, now that may be a poor example, but that's an example of how our inferior function defies our conscious ego desire to be in control and competent and handle everything and feel insulated from life, instead of being in the human lot and needing to ask for help, needing to know your limits. So that's what comes to mind. In paragraph 226, Jung gives a case of a person who suffered from this kind of dissociability of the into her complexes, and to the point that she wasn't functioning well. And his work with her gave her tools with which she could, as he says, objectify her individual complexes enough so that she could ward off the attacks from them, which would want to take over and dissociate her. So in other words, she got familiar enough with these inner worlds to be able to strengthen her ego relative to them and have a more relational process with them, so they just didn't come and take over. And then she woke up sometime later, unaware of what had happened. So that is an example of Jung's pattern of wanting people to work with their dreams and their dream situations and images and figures, to flesh them out, to objectify them, draw them, paint them, sculpt them, dance them, act them out, because bringing them into the three-dimensional world in some form gives them a greater objective that then the ego can relate to, and not just be subject to or just forget and dominate, neither one, but have a relational process with. That's what Jung felt was the goal of individuation, to have a relational process ongoing with your inner community. That's what he thought, I think, individuation really was, is when you could do that, you probably could graduate from seeing a therapist or an analyst, because you have a way of working with yourself in an ongoing way, in a way that I think Jung and Helen perfected and used that in an inspired way. Any questions about that, objectifying unconscious contents?
That'd be like seeing them as in you, but not all of you. So that you have, I know in focusing, it's like you, if there's something that's got you, you sort of see it and you're next to it and you get, so it's so objectifying. I guess I wanted you to say a little more about that word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've all had the experience, I think, of saying, what came over me? I don't know why I did that, you know?
Yeah.
Well, instead of leaving it like that, it's about working with whatever came over you. Hopefully you can get some help from dreams or other processes. Like I'm working with someone who has peripheral neuropathy now, and it's been very vexing. I'm encouraging them to see if they can't start with the feeling of that, instead of feeling less like it's a meaningless affliction that torments them, that they'd like to get rid of, which they can't. There's no way that they've gotten rid of it. To let themselves respect that feeling, use their imagination to let it take a form, whatever form that might be, or it can be a sound or a color or music or anything, and see if they can relate to that objectification. And that gives them a way to work with this as a sort of partner, as opposed to just being a passive sufferer. Sometimes this is quite helpful. Sometimes it isn't. People have different, I think, aptitudes for this.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can be very dramatic.
Yeah.
So it's worth a try.
Yeah.
Don, I think it's significant you said to out of the feeling what it is, and then respect. Can you say a little bit more about that respect of what is it that came over me is where you started, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So what does that mean to respect that?
Well, our ego presumption is that we should be in control, right? And when things happen to us that we didn't plan, we feel traumatized or invaded or hijacked. We're affronted and angry. Well, if it just stays with that, then you just want to get rid of that thing. That's all you want to do. Give me a pill or a drink or whatever. But that doesn't show respect for what the meaning of that might be in your life. So stopping that process, suspending that automatic judgment of the ego, and say, well, let me try to hear what this experience might mean to me. Who are you that made this happen? What do you want from me? What part of me are you? And then try to listen with your sort of third ear.
So it's kind of like shining a light on that rather than trying to run away from it. It's like stopping and say, who are you and what are you doing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's stopping and shining a light on it, inviting it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And I'll say that just for an illustration. I went to a grocery store that's kind of a favorite of mine. And in fact, I used to work there, but because of some medical problems, I had to quit. But I went around the store. I didn't have much money with me and I didn't have much to draw on. Okay, I'm trying to save a little bit here. And I said, okay, this is my limit. And I spent most of my cash at the store. I bought beef bacon, I bought pork bacon, which I already have at home, right? And I got out of that store spending about $60. And I got out to the car and I thought, exactly that. What came over me? What was that about? And I'm still trying to figure it out. So anyway, that was just kind of an illustration of why my question came up.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
And I think grocery stores are a prime arena for this to happen.
That's good.
Oh,
good company then. Now it's in good company.
Oh, sure. I mean, think of all the variety of stimulation you get when you walk through the aisles of a grocery store. It's built to stimulate your imagination. Well, I might need that, or that's a pretty color, or, if you're a little hungry, then you're really in for it,
Yeah.
Because everything looks good.
Sure.
For some of us, it's shoe stores.
Yeah, you get to choose your addiction, huh? Well, I want to draw your attention to paragraph 291 then. And Jung comments this: our sins and errors and mistakes are necessary to us. Otherwise, we are deprived of the most precious incentives to development. Our sins and errors and mistakes are necessary to us. Otherwise, we are deprived of the most precious incentives to development. Mm-hmm. I've thought of this any number of times in my work this week. So many people are afflicted by their feelings of guiltiness that they haven't been perfect enough, or they haven't accomplished things that they wanted in their life. And they're haunted by these things and can't let themselves off the hook. So just hearing that these sins and errors and mistakes are most helpful because they're precious incentives to development is a healing statement to me. And I've felt called to repeat it to people a number of times, and myself for that matter. I don't have the quote in here right in front of me. I can dig it out if you want, but Jung said somewhere that he really keeps an open mind in his expectations for the people he worked with. He chose not to know what they should do or where they should go, but to be open to their choice, even if sometimes it could lead to tragedy. his comment was, I'm on the side of nature. So he was always going to be respectful of what nature had in store for people, regardless of his own ego expectations for them or what their ego expectations for themselves were. He kept an eye out for what nature was wanting them to have an experience of. So I think that's also a useful reminder in our modern world where we get so obsessed with accomplishments and control and comparing ourselves to other people. And in our work with people, to keep an open mind that we have to be humble about what nature has in store for people. So there's a lot more in this passage. Jung works extensively with a couple large dreams. If you're interested in how he worked with dreams, particularly in amplifying them from a mythological standpoint, there's a very long dream in lecture 4 that he does that, which is fascinating. It gives you a window into Jung's breadth of knowledge about these things and why he was so powerful as a dream worker. But I hope that we've been able to touch on a few things tonight, dreams and complexes, and that it's been useful and certainly enjoyable to be with you. So
can I just say about that last thing you said about Jung on the side of nature? I get he was talking about that with this guy that had the 3 dreams that he interpreted, that something to the effect of, if I had worked with him, or if but I don't believe in doing, like, interfering in that way or something. And I have mixed feelings about that, because I felt like maybe he should have sent the guy to someone else then that was willing to do that work,
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, well, this is what's going to happen to him. So,
well, Jung worked at a different era, and he had a different culture that he worked in. In our culture, we always have to be aware of everybody looking over our shoulders and the legal system and the insurance system. So we may have to be prudent in this area more than Jung probably had to be.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. That was really great.
Mary, what you're talking about is in paragraph 207. He says, if I had the intention of being a missionary or a savior, I should have used a clever trick. And then he goes on and explains what the clever trick might have been.
Yeah, that felt like a cop-out to me. Anyway.
I've often wondered if Jung's clients had the benefit of his beautifully wrought explanations of their dreams, if he laid it out to them in the same fashion that he laid it out to the conferences that he was addressing, or in his writings. I remember when I first got interested in all this and first started coming to the farm and was working with Jane, and I was so taken with Jung's beautiful explanations of dreams, explications of dreams. And I said to her once, I was really frustrated at, the fact that she wouldn't do that. I said, Jung would just lay it out for me. And she said, well, I'm not Jung. But I'm not sure that Jung laid it out for his clients either. So
I think it probably varied from client to client, but Jung was such a powerful intuitive that he could read people in a way that was magical. And in Helen's talking to him, he could kind of see her future and encourage her in a certain way that would be presumptive for most of us to do, because we don't have that gift in the same way, and might have overstepped some boundaries in sometimes. But yeah, I do think that Jung sometimes would elaborate mythologically on dreams for people. I've heard people talk about that. That if he felt that was important to them, he would do that. Yep.
I wonder if he would ever have described himself as a mystic.
I think so.
Yes?
I think he would.
Mhm.
But he would have meant that in a psychological sense.
Mhm.
Well, in his working with Ebby Thatcher, you referred to earlier, as one of the kind of the forerunners of Alcoholics Anonymous. He told him that he was hopeless. He said, "You're the variety of alcoholic that's hopeless. There's no hope for you.
Yeah.
The only thing you can do is to change spiritually.
Yeah.
You can quit, you can do anything, but you're hopeless. You can't stop."
Mhm.
He saw that.
Yep. Yeah, I think he didn't mince words with many people.
Well, and you say how intuitive he was. My guess is that he really did not follow a specific therapeutic process the same with every person. It was very
Absolutely
individual.
not. Yeah, he abhorred technique. He decried the application of techniques for technique's sake. He was very much a free spirit in that regard.
So he was both a don't interfere kind of guy and you're hopeless, like Ken's saying, kind of guy, right?
Yep.
And more. But
Or interfere.
yeah.
Yeah, he was proud to say, "I'm glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian."
Yeah.
Because he didn't want anybody making his way into a formulary codex, like this guy who's done family systems. He's formulated into a kind of formula that he teaches to people, and you can get training in it and get up 3 levels, and then you apply it to people. So it's a kind of machine that you apply to people. Jung would be horrified at that. Not completely, because I think there's some usefulness to it, but it's too codified. It's too limiting. It doesn't stay open to the variety of experience that dreams bring. So he would have issues with that.
There's a lot of that going on out there.
Oh, sure, because everybody wants techniques and people want quick cures. And sure, we live in North America where, utility and quick fixes are the name of the game.
Cookie cutters.
Cookie cutters, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.